So, like everyone else, I'm a big fan of zombie movies, zombie comics, dressing up as a zombie, seeing my son when he was 14 filming zombie flicks outside our house, most famously by putting some sausages and tomato ketchup under a t-shirt, lying in the road and having his friends rip his innards out and scatter them across the street, to the point where one of my neighbours said, "We're okay with the zombies, but you could ask them to go to be less serious about the meat cleavers," because they were running up and down the street. So I want to share something with you that you might find very important when you take home, which is that the network wants your brain. Okay? It doesn't actually... Thank you. Not quite in the way you might think. There are not people sitting out there on the internet waiting to consume you, although obviously there is an enormous amount of zombie culture online which you can take advantage of. No, the network, this is my favorite, the network wants your brain in a rather more subtle way. It wants it in this form. It wants your brain to be able to pay attention to the constant stream of information and facts that are coming. It wants your brain to be able to chunk up that sort of image and make sense of it. And I think this, our engagement with these technologies, the things that all of us in this room are now finding increasingly comfortable to do, should cause us to pause and think about what the longer-term implications of our love for these tools is. So if we're going to be relying on our iPhones and iPad apps and our mobile phones and everything like that, we've got to ask what is really going on. Because I confess that I am what they might call a physicalist. I believe that for every mental event, there's a corresponding physical event. I believe that you are here. That what inheres in your brain, situated in your body, is all of you. Okay, I'm a liberal humanist, atheist, socialist type. You all know that of me anyway, and you let me stand on your stage, that's fine. But fundamentally, I think what's going on in your nervous system is you. And that the patterns of activities between all of the neurons, the connections there, define who you are and make you that person. And the ways those connections shift and shape through your life, the enormous plasticity of the human brain, is the secret of our success as a species, and may well be the reason for our demise as a species if we don't actually get some sense, but let's put that to one side. But that there are implications about the ways we're now deploying the technologies that we all love so much, that whilst I'm not worried about, I think we should be aware of. So, an exercise for the class. Okay, I want you all to read the next sentence. Obviously you can read that, but that's not the exercise. Those are the instructions, and that shouldn't be hard. Okay. Okay. Did most of you have the sense of having to go back to the first bow to make it a bow when you saw the second bow? Okay, that's good. Some of you may not have done. People have different reading styles, and some people don't read in the same way. But most of you will have seen that. You'll have got quite a long way into that sentence, then you went back and remade it. You reinterpreted it. That process is astonishing. It is the miracle of humanity. Being able to read, being able to extract meaning from these letter shapes on that screen, be able to pull out the words, map them to the sounds in our language, extract that meaning, and to do so fluently and effectively, and then, if you've got a long narrative, Moby Dick, whatever, to be able to hold on to all of that sense throughout the story that is told to the very end, is the defining characteristic. It is what makes us what we are as a species. And it's very important to notice that... Sorry, did I go on too? Thank you. It's very important to notice that we are now beginning to understand how reading works. Those of you who've seen me recently will know I've been carrying this around a lot, and screenshots appear all over the place. There's a book called Proust and the Squid by Marianne Wolf, and it's an attempt to synthesize an enormous amount of our knowledge about how the reading brain works. For her, it's about then understanding what dyslexia might be. And essentially, dyslexia is the artistically gifted finding a different and better strategy for reading that falls down when you want to do fluent reading. So people who have enormous artistic skills learn how to do the interpretive part of letter shapes into words using a strategy which doesn't scale. It's like deploying Windows servers if you've got a big website. Looks so good to start with, and eventually you're fucked. So, Wolf synthesizes an enormous amount of research, and she has looked in detail and tried to give a plausible story about how reading actually works. And it's a very good story. And the main point she makes is that none of us were born to read. That reading, writing and reading, maybe 8,000 years, maybe 6,000 years, depending on who you listen to, that's a very small time in the species, and certainly not long enough for any serious evolution to have gone on. So we are all born illiterate, whereas we are born with the capacity for language hardwired into our genes. We develop brains that do speaking and listening. Language is now innate in the human being. It's hard not to do it. Reading is something that everybody has to be taught from scratch. And the surprising thing is, perhaps, that so many of us manage it successfully. And that we have constructed over the last 2,000 years a range of literate cultures. Cultures that rely on access to the written word, on the ability to place things in this external memory of writing and have access to it again to construct civilization on top of that. Every child has to be taught to read. This country invests billions of pounds each year creating customers for bookshops. You know, it's a great investment in subsidizing the industry, I suppose, but it's also incredibly important, and we know that it is important. And now, thanks to the work of the neuropsychologists, thanks to the stuff that can be done with functional magnetic resonance imaging and all that, we're beginning to see how the process works. And what we see is that areas of the brain that have clearly evolved for another purpose, because none of the brain has evolved for reading, are taken over, are used by the reading system. And the process of learning to read is, as I've said before, like doing brain surgery without a scalpel. That the visual system has to identify these shapes. They then need to be identified as letters, as plausible letters. They're the right way round. Word groups need to be identified. Words need to be spotted. Once the word is identified, we go and find its sound. The mapping between the grapheme, the written representation, and the phoneme, the sound, is made, and we use that to access memory and context. We use that to make sense of these squiggles on paper or on the screen. We use that to extract the meaning. We use that to read. Give anybody a word, they can identify it, even if they don't know what it means, that it is a word, within 500 milliseconds, half a second. A lot of processes are going on in parallel, but crucially, the parts of the brain that are being used for this, and here's a sketch I did earlier, the parts of the brain that are being used for this would have been used for something else had we not read. And there are clear morphological differences between the brains of literate and illiterate people, and clear functional difference as well in their access to different parts of memory. So, main point is learning to read makes things different. Now, because we can read, we can tell stories in different ways. And when Alan was talking about stories earlier, I thought it was wonderful that I had this, which is one of my absolute favorite quotes up there. This is Joan Didion, who says, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." That it is that telling of stories that really matters. And so I want to tell you a little story about me, which illuminates what goes on in my mind, and I believe what goes on in your minds, because I have done you all the courtesy of assuming you have minds. Having done philosophy at university, it's not a guarantee that I would think that, but in fact I am going to allow that you all have consciousness, just for this afternoon. So I want to tell you a story. Start with a question. What does this photograph mean? And I actually mean that. What does this photograph mean? I was in Dublin about 3 months ago for a conference called MASH, and that's James Joyce's telephone. Not James Joyce's, sorry, Samuel Beckett's telephone. It's in the Writers' Museum in Dublin. And it's very special because it's from his apartment in Paris. And you notice, if you can see, there's a button. There's a red button, and to the right there's a green button. There are two buttons. And if you press the red button down, no incoming calls. When Beckett was willing to take a call, he'd press the green button down, and his friends who knew which times of the day he did that could call him. He might still not answer, and if he answered, he might not say anything, but at least you were in with a chance. And I took this photograph in the morning before I was giving my presentation in the afternoon, and I put it in my presentation because I thought it's a really nice photograph. And I was doing my talk, and I was using Keynote, and Keynote, you can't really see, but Keynote tells you the next slide coming up. So I know the next slide is a picture of a screenshot from my laptop, so I can prepare. And I was standing on the stage talking about something to do with digital culture, as I do, and I looked, and I saw the next slide is the photograph of Beckett's phone, and I thought, I have no idea why I put that in there. It was a nice photo. I have not got a clue what I can say about that apart from, and Dublin's a very nice place to visit, isn't it? Look, here's a photograph I took earlier in one of your fine museums, which wasn't going to work with that audience. And I felt myself detach part of my brain. I felt it happen, say, a sub-process was spawned, geeks. And it said, find me something sensible to say and fast. And I relaxed then, and I started talking, and then the photograph came up, and I said, and we sometimes think we can cut ourselves off from digital culture, and I thought, win. But I had no idea what I was going to say until I said it, and I had no real idea that I would get to say anything, but I relied on my system. Because for me, consciousness is not this unitary thing. It's not that I'm constantly paying attention. It's that my brain is made up of multiple competing voices, subsystems in a computing term, demons they've been called by some psychologists. And the one that has the focus, the attention at the moment, inherits a whole state of stuff that's in your head and tries to make sense of it and give it some coherence, and sometimes it fails. That's why sometimes you wake up in the morning not knowing who you are, not knowing what you've been doing, not knowing what bed is, but not having just a clue about anything. And sometimes the only reason you know things aren't bad is because the person you wake up next to doesn't scream when they see you, so they were clearly expecting you to be there. Now, this is not much of a basis on which to build a personality, but I think it's actually all we've got. If we are operating in this way, if all this stuff is going on, that has some implications. For me, one of the implications is that thanks to my smartphone, which is sitting over there, and which I can actually feel, tense, I'm always online. There's always part of me that is connected to the network. I know that lots of people out there are talking about the news of the world and whether it's just a ploy by Murdoch and there's going to be the Sunday Sun and what's that. I'm aware of all of that in some of the subsystems in my mind, just as some other subsystems are aware of my heart rate or the time or all sorts of things. But thanks to the affordances of these very powerful connected tools, I am to some extent always connected. I'm in this liminal space between online and offline constantly. And not to decide not to check that is actually to shut down part of my brain. Just for a little bit, just a little bit of my brain. Now this raises some interesting questions because there's only so much brain and there are only so many systems. So what's actually happening when I'm looking at something like that? What's actually going on whilst I am interpreting that mess, that complex overlapping windows, different sources of information that are my online life? And how come I can be, as I was on a train back from London 2 days ago, in a flow of work around 2 or 3 different projects simultaneously whilst surrounded by sweaty commuters, cramped into a chair that is too small for me? How is that working in my head? And one question that occurs to me about it is, if I can do all that, what am I not doing now? Or what will I not be doing as well? If this is a representation of the connectivity of my brain, how is that shifting in order to accommodate the new skill set? How is it moving around in order to allow me to do so effectively the many things I do online, to cope with a companion device and a second screen? I remember the US presidential elections when Obama was swept to victory on a tide of optimism. I still remember the tide of optimism. I'm really trying to retain my connection with the tide of optimism. But I remember, because I watched it at home, and I had my laptop, I had my iPad, I had my phone, I had a projector plugged into my Mac Mini, and I had about 10 different sources of information, including BBC radio and an American radio station going on simultaneously, because the voices were so different, it was very easy to tell them apart. And this sort of almost sort of Thomas Jerome man who fell to earth type information overload really worked for me. That and the alcohol. And I really enjoyed it, and I got a lot out of it. And I think that those of us who are deeply immersed in these technologies have to accept that the skills we are developing may be using some of those areas of the brain that were previously used for different things. And some of those things might be about literacy and reading. And if it's happening to us, it might happen to others. Now, I'm not the first person to have said this. I think I'm being slightly less shrill than some of the noted commentators, some of whom have a distinguished scientific background, who have written editorials and articles about this, but there is still something going on here. This report on the impact of digital technologies on human well-being was published on Tuesday, commissioned by the Nominate Trust, and it's well worth reading, downloaded. It's about 90 pages, but 40 of them are background notes and stuff. And it looks at all of these different areas. It's remarkably sensible, and I want you to, okay, here, none of you have read the report yet? Do you think it says, conclusively, this is what we need to do, or we really need more research in these areas? Okay, show of hands. Who thinks it lays down very clearly the outcome of the research and sorts the issue out once and for all, and we won't have another piece of publication? You're a shrewd, if somewhat cynical bunch, aren't you? And who thinks more research is called for? Absolutely. And that's good, because we want the research. You see, I like texts. I like being deep in a book. I like that sense of losing myself in the narrative, in the story, of being part of it, of being disconnected. And I've had many years, many years, being trained how to do that sort of deep reading. If I've changed my brain, it's been an adult brain that's less plastic than a child's brain anyway, and I've done it voluntarily and freely. But the world my kids have grown up in, and the world all of our kids and everyone else is going to grow up in from now on, has these technologies as a given. And if it's going to happen, it's as well we know. I do not think it will be a bad thing. I'm not saying that the decline of literacy will be inevitable and it is the end of civilization. Civilizations and cultures and even species reinvent themselves. We learned how to do reading. Reading is, I think, the most important thing. It's the thing that shifted us, made things possible, that made all of this possible. And we're starting to learn how to do something else. And I'm interested to know about the characteristics of that something else. And in particular, I think we can start to look now at what's happening with brain research and just begin to get some thoughts about which bits of our brain the internet really wants. Is it the bits that does word recognition that help us to do reading so fluently, because in fact they can be better used to chunk up the screen image that we saw and help you tell which is a Facebook window from what's Twitter from what's email? I don't know. I do know that they are coming. They're coming. And that just to blithely assume there will be no change would be foolish. And if we leave this space, it will be taken by the people who think that all of these wondrous digital technologies that help us tell these news stories are a bad thing and they will stand in our way. And we should be trying to guide the development of this new stage of whatever it is we've chosen to do to our brains. Thank you.